Hello and welcome to this video on the recurrent laryngeal nerve, or the nerve that makes speech possible, to some extent. If you are suddenly and unexpectedly decapitated, you'd be able to see several interesting structures as your head fell to the ground. These include the esophagus, trachea, and carotid arteries. Sadly, you'll not be able to see the nervous structure that is in your neck, at least not clearly. Sure, there's a spinal cord, but that's not the most interesting element in your neck at least. What you would want to see, other than the medics rushing towards you, is the nerves, and specifically the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This particular nerve is a branch of the vagus nerve, and it pretty much powers all of the muscles in your larynx. This is otherwise known as your voice box. This may not sound like a lot, but there's more to it than you'd think, so we'll break it down into something much easier to understand. Let's start with the vagus nerve. Unlike vagus, what happens here does not stay here. Instead, it is a nerve that runs all the way from your brain, all the way down to your anus. It is one of the longest nerves in the human body. Further to being this big, this nerve is also a mixed nerve. That means that unlike other nerves, where they are either afferent or efferent, it is both. That is both sensory and motor, or more literally, it can sense what is happening, and the brain can directly tell your local tissues how to respond. This helps very clearly with responding to stimuli quickly, or giving a fine degree of motor control in the case of the voice box. There are two nerves that make up the recurrent laryngeal nerves. Rather importantly, you need two, the right and the left. That's because you need to innervate both sides of the trachea. The right and left nerves are not exactly symmetrical. There is a small amount of difference between them. This difference is largely owing to the aortic arch. The left nerve will pass under the aortic arch, and this is how it begins to form along the carotid arteries, while the right goes under the right subclavian artery, and then it begins to travel upwards. Both of them travel alongside the trachea once they return back to your neck. The other thing here is recurrent. In this instance, recurrent means that while the rest of the vagus nerve has to travel downwards to reach the anus, these nerves go back upwards towards the head. Depending on how you view some people, this might actually be a second anus, but anatomically it's different, and hence why they're called recurrent. They're going against the direction of the vagus nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerves branch off of the vagus, and they come off just where the aortic arch is for the left part, and the right at the right subclavian artery. Both of them will pass around the aortic arch to some extent, or at least the right. Both come back into the neck, but they take slightly different pathways. The left will pass in front of the aortic arch and then comes up and underneath it. This is basically creating a big loop. After branching, it will generally ascend up where the juncture of the trachea and the esophagus is. So if you were to feel in your chest, you'd find that slight divot where the clavicles come together. Just behind this is where it begins to ascend. It also begins to move in towards the trachea near to where the thyroid gland is, and it will enter underneath where the inferior aspect is, passing up and alongside the trachea. On the other side, you have the right recurrent laryngeal nerve, and this passes up and underneath the right clavicle, and then comes back in the same sort of way. Why it's important is that the recurrent laryngeal nerve controls all the muscles in the larynx, with the exception of the cricothyroid muscles, which aren't as important for the purposes of what we're going to go towards. Why it's important is that it ensures these muscles will open and close and adjust as needed. The adjustment is for the tensioning, and this allows for the vocal cords to allow you to speak properly, or at least clearly, and will alter both the pitch and tone. For the most part, each of these sides of your trachea, and specifically your larynx, are innervated separately, with the exception of the interorytenoid muscle, which is innervated by both of these nerves together, but on both sides. Now, why they're important and why they need to have both innervation and sensory abilities is that they carry the sensory information, particularly from the mucous membranes of the larynx, below the vocal fold. This allows for the sensation in knowing what's passing through and, to an extent, how to make noises and modulate those noises using the motor fibers to then change what sound's being made. For example, altering the pitch, tone, how fast air will move through, and so on. It allows, in some respects, for speech. Admittedly, later parts of your cranial nerves, or later cranial nerves to be clear, are responsible for things like the tongue movement, jaw, lips, and so on. But at least initially, you need this. If, for whatever reason, these nerves get injured, it can result in a number of issues. One of the first and simplest is a hoarse voice, or it basically weakens the muscle activity. In more extreme cases, it can lead to a loss of voice entirely, if only temporarily in some instances. This is based on the idea of injury. Now, injury doesn't necessarily need to be to both of the nerves, remembering there's a right and a left. So, if only one side is injured, it can alter the nature of how you're able to speak, because you're only able to use half of your vocal cords. The other effect that can occur is that you may not be able to breathe properly if the nerves cause paralysis, as remembering they're responsible for at least partly opening up the muscles or the folds within your larynx, and without that, air can't pass through. Now, speaking on the way out is what air will be responsible for, but getting air in is more important in most cases. This is why the recurrent laryngeal nerve is oddly important, but also oddly strange. It simultaneously lets us speak, but it may also make you want to make some people just shut up. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.